Well, good evening to all. I so wish we were live right now. Instead, I am in my new home here, uh, awaiting the changes that are happening with Meta and YouTube and the rest, and with the program I use for doing the live streaming. It's caused me all sorts of problems. But I am grateful that you are here and there watching at this point in time. Thank you for being with me this entire semester through this entire study of the Screwtape letters. I'm so grateful for that. And so grateful for you for all that you've done, and for if you're watching this the day after I post this, or if you're watching this 6 years from now. I'm so grateful that you've hopefully watched some of the other ones that have led up to this very point of where we are, which is Screwtape Proposes a Toast. But I'm just grateful for your presence and for you being part of this study. This is a longer one, so I'm looking forward to diving in with you on this one. So without further ado, let's dive right in. And I will say at the end, there is going to be a little surprise. It is actually the new little series that I'm planning on doing over this summer, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that too. And so it will be a separate series that you can also catch up on, even if you're watching later on through just our YouTube and the rest. So, with no further ado, here we go. Screwtape letter. Screwtape proposes a toast. So, just a quick understanding of this is that this was published in 1958-59, where the original Screwtape letters were posted in 1942, 41, 42, right around there. And it was quite a fascinating thing because there was quite a few years in between. Obviously, World War II has now ended. There had been a lot of clamoring for Lewis to write, in essence, a continuation of his writings of the Screwtape letters because they were so well received. But he had kind of put them off and just decided not really to do that until 1959, when it was published in the Saturday Evening Post. Was when it was first proposed and set forth. And then later on, and as you probably have in your book, if you have the book itself, you probably have this copy. If you have this copy, it's actually included in the book as part of the Screwtape letters on the whole. But it was published much later on, right before Lewis's death, in fact. And so this was a much later writing from the original ones. Now, there's an interesting part about why he says this. In fact, he actually writes and says, "Though I had never written anything more easily, I never wrote with less enjoyment." And so I just want to stop there real quick. So that's one of the reasons that he gives as to why he didn't really pursue a continuation of the Screwtape letters. It's because it was too much. He didn't enjoy it. And in fact, he concludes by saying, "Every trace of beauty, freshness, and geniality had to be excluded. It almost smothered me before I was done. It would have smothered my readers if I had prolonged it." And so there's an aspect in where he's basically saying, I was doing my best to really not make this a continuation. I just felt like it was too heavy. It would have been too much for too many. And so without further ado, we dive into the toast. It is a much longer reading. In fact, it's almost like reading 3 letters in one, and so we will dive into it this tonight. I will be reading much larger passages at a time before I make some comments, so just a heads up on that. The scene is in hell at the annual dinner of the Tempter's Training College for Young Devils. The principal, Dr. Slubgob, has just proposed the health of the guest. Screwtape, who is the guest of honor, rises to reply. So this is the fascinating note. So it kind of sets the scene. They're almost at a university level. This is, a banquet style into the semester. New graduates are about to go into the world as tempters, and here they are proposing the toast. And Screwtape is as the guest of honor. So this has been a few years since the letters were written and the rest, and here we are. "Mr. Principal, your eminence, your disgraces, my thorns, shadies, and gentle devils. It is customary on these occasions for the speaker to address himself chiefly to those among you who have been just graduated and who will very soon be posted to official tempterships on earth. It is a custom I willingly obey. I will remember with what trepidation I awaited my own first appointment. I hope and believe that each one of you has the same uneasiness tonight. Your career is before you. Hell expects and demands that it should be, as mine was, one of unbroken success. If it is not, you know what awaits you." And I will just note this very strong sense of his own bravado, his own ego, and the rest because of his greatness that he has had in his own tempting that he did, but also the weariness in which the tempters might feel knowing what awaits them, as we saw what awaited Wormwood at the end of his failure on earth as a tempter. "I have no wish to reduce the wholesome and realistic element of terror, the unremitting anxiety which must act as the lash and spur to your endeavors. How often you will envy the humans their faculty of sleep. Yet at the same time, I would wish to put before you a moderately encouraging view of the strategical situation as a whole. Your dreaded principal has included in a speech full of points something like an apology for the banquet which he has set up before us. Well, gentle devils, no one blames him. But it would be in vain to deny that the human souls on whose anguish we have been feasting tonight were of pretty poor quality. Not all the most skillful cookery of our tormentors could make them better than insipid. So there's this imagery of which he's actually portraying that they're feasting on the souls of humans in this scenario. Here in hell, in essence, they're dining on the souls, but the quality of the food, in essence, is not good enough. It's not very good. And this is a fascinating take on that. Oh, to get one's teeth into a Farinata, a Henry VIII, or even a Hitler. There was real crackling there, something to crunch, a rage, an egotism, a cruelty only just less robust than our own. It put up a delicious resistance to being devoured. It warmed your inwards when you'd got it down. So even the idea of them eating the souls of mankind, there's different level of it. Like there's good meat, good food and bad food. And like to get a Hitler, there was something good about it. It was a good crunch, a rage, an egotism, a cruelty that was there that just tasted better in essence. Instead of this, what have we had tonight? There was a municipal authority with graft sauce. But personally, I could not detect in him the flavor of a really passionate and brutal avarice such as delighted one in the great tycoons of the last century. So what did they have for dinner? They had a guy who was in municipal authority with a little bit of graft sauce. So he was like mid-level, not really all that great, and it wasn't all that wonderful to eat. Was he not unmistakably a little man, a creature of the petty rake, pocketed with a petty joke in private and denied with the stalest platitudes in his public utterances? A grubby little nonentity who had drifted into corruption, only just realizing that he was corrupt, and chiefly because everyone else did it? So basically saying he was bad, but it wasn't really all that bad. And so that's just a fascinating little note here. It's the way he's playing off of the concept of sins, and they just don't taste as good. Then there was the lukewarm casserole of adulterers. Could you find in it any trace of a fully inflamed, defiant, rebellious, insatiable lust? I couldn't. They all tasted to me like undersexed morons who had blundered or tricked their way into wrong beds in automatic response to sexy advertisements, or to make themselves feel modern and emancipated, or to reassure themselves about their virility or their normalcy, or even because they had nothing else to do. Frankly, to me, who have tasted Messalina and Casanova, they were nauseating. He's distinguishing basically from real adulterers to those who just kind of fall into this lifestyle, and the rest have been tricked into these things, but there's no real evil in them. They just fell prey to their instincts and the rest. The trade unionist stuffed with sedition was perhaps a shade better. He had done some real harm. He had, not quite unknowingly, worked for bloodshed, famine, and the extinction of liberty. Yes, in a way, but what a way! He thought of those ultimate objectives so little, towing the party line, self-importance, and above all, mere routine, were what was really dominated his life. But now comes the point. Gastronomically, all this is deplorable, but I hope none of us puts gastronomy first. Is it not, in another and far more serious way, full of hope and promise? Consider first the mere quantity. The quality may be wretched, but we have never had souls of a sort in more abundance. And then the triumph. We are tempted to say that such souls or such residual puddles of what once was soul are hardly worth damning. Yes, but the enemy, for whatever inscrutable and perverse reason, thought them worth trying to save. Believe me, he did. You youngsters who have not yet been on active duty have no idea with what labor, with what delicate skill each of these miserable creatures was finally captured. The difficulty lay in their very smallness and flabbiness. Here were vermin so muddled in mind, so passively responsive to environment, that it was very hard to raise them to that level of clarity and deliberateness at which mortal sin becomes possible. To raise them just enough, but not that fatal millimeter of too much, for then, of course, all would possibly have been lost. They might have seen, they might have repented. On the other hand, if they had been raised too little, they would very possibly have qualified for limbo, as creatures suitable neither for heaven nor for hell. Things that have failed to make the grade are allowed to sink into a more or less contented subhumanity forever. and each individual choice of what the enemy would call the wrong turning, such creatures are at first hardly, if at all, in a state of full spiritual responsibility. They do not understand either the source or the real character of the prohibitions they are breaking. Their consciousness hardly exists apart from the social atmosphere that surrounds them. So all of this little diatribe that he goes off of is basically to note that we've never had more humans than we've ever had than in history than what we have right now. And even historically, that's actually true. I mean, the numbers of humanity have exploded over the last 100 years in ways that had never been seen in the ancient world. And then he's going into, some of them are they're so tricked into this so easily now. Most of them don't even realize that they're lost. And in some ways, he's going to make the argument that that's actually a good thing. That's something that they've been doing that has worked out very well. But in others, it just makes for a not that great of an eating in the end. And of course, we have contrived that their very language should be all smudge and blur. What would be a bribe in someone else's profession is a tip or a present in theirs. The job of their tempters was first, of course, to harden these choices of the hellward roads into a habit by steady repetition. But then, and this was all important, to turn the habit into a principle the creature is prepared to defend. After that, all will go well. Conformity to the social environment, at first merely instinctive or even mechanical, how should a jelly not conformed? Now becomes an unacknowledged creed or ideal of togetherness or being like folks. Mere ignorance of the law they break now turns into a vague theory about it. Remember, they know no history. A theory expressed by calling it conventional or Puritan or bourgeois morality. So here he's kind of getting into this very real sense of getting them to not even realize that they've gotten into this is the slow, methodical boiling of the individual. They don't even realize that they've fallen prey to something. And I would make the argument in this that abortion falls into this, that there are people out there who believe in Christianity who do not see abortion as problematic at all. And how do you arrive at that such point? Well, you douse it in the small little things, in women's rights movements, and you douse it in bodily autonomy. You douse it in all the other things except for that which it actually is, if you were to stop for a second and realize the murder of a child. That's kind of what he's hinting at. Thus, gradually there comes to exist at the center of the creature a hard, tight, settled core of resolution to go on being what it is, and even to resist moods that might tend to alter it. It is a very small core, not all reflective, they are too ignorant, nor defiant, their emotional and imaginative poverty excludes that, almost in its own way, prim and demure, like a pebble or a very young cancer. But it will serve our turn. Here at last is a real and deliberate, though not fully articulate, rejection of what the enemy calls grace. These, then, are two welcome phenomenon. First, the abundance of our captures. However tasteless our fare, we are in no danger of famine. And secondly, the triumph. The skill of our tempters has never stood higher. But the third moral, which I have not yet drawn, is the most important of all. The sort of souls on whose despair and ruin we have, well, I won't say feasted, but at any rate subsisted, tonight are increasing in numbers and will continue to increase. Our advices from lower command assure us that this is so. Our directives warn us to orient all our tactics in view of this situation. So basically, we're not even having to make people really, truly evil. We just make them to where they don't realize they're lost. That's ultimately what he's getting at. Make their morality or their understanding of right and wrong so subjective, so, without any actual hardness to it, and make them unwilling to change things that they know that they might ought to, but make it to where they're just going through life. Just lull them to sleep over and over. The great sinners, those in whom vivid and genial passions have been pushed beyond the bounds and in whom an immense concentration of will has been devoted to objects which the enemy abhors, will not disappear, but they will grow rarer. Our catches will be even more numerous, but they will consist increasingly of trash which we should once have thrown to Cerberus and to the hellhounds as unfit for diabolical consumption. So basically, we're not getting the good souls anymore. We're just getting the trash of the souls. And there are two things I want you to understand about this. First, that however depressing it might seem, it is really a change for the better. And secondly, it would draw your attention to the means by which it has been brought about. It is a change for the better. The great and toothsome sinners are made out of the very same material as those horrible phenomenon, the great saints. The virtual disappearance of such material may mean insipid meals for us, but is it not utter frustration and famine for the enemy? He did not create the humans. He did not become one of them and die among them by torture in order to produce candidates for limbo, failed humans. Here in limbo, he's kind of referencing the concept of purgatory within the premise here. He wanted to make them saints, gods, things like himself. Is the dullness of your present fare not a very small price to pay for the delicious knowledge that his whole great experiment is petering out? But not only that, and so here he's kind of hinting at this idea. It's not just that we don't get good meals anymore, and we won't get good meals anymore. There's just not as many bad people, really bad people, as they were. But at least take enjoyment in the fact that God will be disappointed in losing these souls. As the great sinners grow fewer and the majority lose all individuality, the great sinners become far more effective agents for us. Every dictator or even demagogue, almost every film star or crooner, can now draw tens of thousands of the human sheep with him. They give themselves what there is of them to him, in him, to us. Boy, if you look at the whole premise of influencers and the rise of social media and actors and actresses and wanting to be like them and the rest, and how many people are led astray from God, this is kind of what he's hinting at. And boy, has this not played itself out in reality. Here may come a time when we shall have no need to bother about individual temptation at all, except for the few. Catch the bellwether and his whole flock comes after him. But do you realize how we have succeeded in reducing so many of the human race to the level of ciphers? This has not come about by accident. It has been our answer, and our magnificent answer it is to one of the most serious challenges we ever had to face. Let me recall to your minds what the human situation was in the latter half of the 19th century, the period at which I ceased to be a practicing tempter and was rewarded with an administrative post. The great movement towards liberty and equality among men had by then borne solid fruits and grown mature. Slavery had been abolished. The American War of Independence had been won. The French Revolution had succeeded. In that moment, there had originally been many elements which were in our favor. Much atheism, much anti-clericalism, much envy and thirst for revenge, even some rather absurd attempts to revive paganism were mixed in. It was not easy to determine what our own attitude should be. On the one hand, it was a bitter blow to us. It still is, that any sort of men who had been hungry should be fed, or any who had long worn chains should have them struck off. But on the other hand, there was in the movement so much rejection of faith, so much materialism, secularism, and hatred that we felt we were bound to encourage it. And so one of the fascinating parts about this is there's an aspect in where he's actually talking about modernism and progressivism here as actually negatives, because so much of what faith and the rest that were rejected in those moments ended up being kind of lost to history. In fact, I would easily make the argument that we are worse off as both a nation in the United States and worse off in any place in the world when you have less Christianity, less Christians. I believe that to be plausibly true and also historically true. It doesn't mean that Christians are perfect in any way, shape, or form, but Christian ideals and Christian levels of morality absolutely have shaped Western civilization for the better. And when suddenly truth becomes relative in postmodernism, and your truth becomes your truth, and we're seeing this play out each and every day, where laws don't seem to apply to some, where they seem to apply to others. Over and over again, this seems to play itself out, and this is kind of what he's hinting at, is that it's actually been for our good. Yeah, slaves were freed, and things were, and people were hungry, were getting fed, but there was also a lot of secularism, a lot of hatred, and so forth, and so we were just bound to encourage it. But by the latter part of the century, the situation was much simpler and also much more ominous. In the English sector, where I saw most of my frontline service, a horrible thing had happened. The enemy, with his usual sleight of hand, had largely appropriated this progressive or liberalizing movement and perverted it to his own ends. Very little of its old anti-Christianity remained. The dangerous phenomenon called Christian socialism was rampant. Factory owners of the good old type who grew rich on sweated labor instead of being assassinated by their work people, we could have used that, were being frowned upon by their own class. The rich were increasingly giving up their powers not in the face of revolution or compulsion, but in obedience to their own consciousness. As for the poor who benefited by this, they were behaving in a much disappointing fashion. Instead of using their new liberties, as we reasonably hoped and expected, for massacre, rape, and looting, or even for perpetual intoxication, they were perversely engaged in becoming cleaner, more orderly, more thrifty, better educated, and even more virtuous. Believe me, gentle devils, the threat of something like a really healthy state of society seemed then perfectly serious. Thanks to our Father below, the threat was averted. Here he's referencing, obviously, Satan. Our counterattack was on two levels. On the deepest level, our leaders contrived to call into full life an element which had been implicit in the movement from its earliest days. Hidden in the heart of this striving for liberty, there was also a deep hatred of personal freedom. That invaluable man Rousseau first revealed it. In his perfect democracy, only the state religion is permitted, slavery is restored, and the individual is told that he has really willed, though he didn't know it, whatever the government tells him to do. From that starting point, via Hegel, another indispensable propagandist on our side, we easily contrived both the Nazi and the Communist Party. Even in England, we were pretty successful. I heard the other day that in the country a man could not, without a permit, cut down his own tree with his own axe, make it into planks with his own saw, and use the planks to build a tool shed in his own garden. Such was our counterattack on one level. You who are mere beginners will not be entrusted with work of that kind. You will be attached as tempters to private persons. Against them or through them, our counterattack takes a different form. But did you notice that whole premise that he just kind of outlined there, both through communism and Nazism? I do believe this. He's basically saying we replaced the very concept of all the good things that were happening with, well, the government took place of what once was done by private individuals, by the individual looking after his neighbor, loving his neighbor, by the individual doing the things that he was called to do. And instead, this had shifted now to, well, the government will take care of that. And I would make the very strong argument that we have absolutely done that in our own culture today, where there are many people who specifically vote against a certain party. They'll say, well, against Christian nationalism as an example. But at the same moment, the main reason they're voting for the opposite party can be directly attributed to the fact that they feel like it is a more Christian thing to do because the government provides for the weak and the weary and the immigrant and so forth. And so they don't even see that they're actually perpetuating their own form of Christian nationalism. It's just, in my view, and this is Brandon's personal opinion, that they've been fooled into thinking that they're actually against the very thing that they're perpetuating in those moments. Democracy is the word with which you must lead them by the nose. Now, this is a key component. In fact, it goes with what I just said. The good work which our philological experts have already done in the corruption of human language makes it unnecessary to warn you that they should never be allowed to give this word a clear and definable meaning. They won't. And let me give you an example of that, because this is happening in our day and age right now. We must save our democracy. And you keep asking, what are you talking about? So often, it would seem when that is used, it actually means that we are the only party that has of any value. So save our democracy means keep us in power. That's ultimately what it means. And by defining it the way I just did, that's what the devil does not want us to do. He doesn't want us to define it. Instead, it becomes just a philological game, a game of language and words. It will never occur to them that democracy is properly the name of a political system, even a system of voting, and that this is only the most remote and tenuous connection with what you are trying to sell them. Nor, of course, must they ever be allowed to raise Aristotle's question whether democratic behavior means the behavior that democracies like or the behavior that will preserve a democracy. For if they did, it could hardly fail to occur to them that these need to be the same. That's a key component. You are to use the word purely as an incantation, if you like, purely for its selling power. It is a name they venerate. And of course it is connected with the political ideal that men should be equally treated. You then make a stealthy transition in their minds from this political ideal to a factual belief that all men are equal. So, for example, every time I hear all men are created equal, I hear a very particular thing. When I hear save our democracy or we need to make sure that we keep our democracy, at the same time when you see political opponents being banned from social media, when you see people trying to curb free speech, do those things of that nature, you start to realize they're not talking about democracy in the way that the actual things were meant. They're using and playing word games so often in these scenarios. Especially the man you are working on. As a result, you can use the word democracy to sanction in his thought the most degrading and also the least enjoyable of human feelings. You can get him to practice, not only without shame, but with a positive glow of self-approval, conduct which, if undefended by the magic word, would be universally derided. Prosecuting your political rivals or overturning elections. I mean, that's a double-edged sword going both ways. And I think that this is a game that's currently being played in a fairly public manner in our culture right now in the United States in 2024. The feeling, I mean, is, of course, that which prompts a man to say, I'm as good as you. Now, here's a key component. The first and most obvious advantage is that you thus induce him to enthrone at the center of his life a good, solid, resounding lie. I don't merely that his statement is false, in fact, that he is no more equal to everyone he meets in kindness, honesty, and good sense than in height or waist or measurement. I mean that he does not believe it himself. No man who says, I'm as good as you, believes it. He would not say it if he did. The St. Bernard never says it to the toy dog, nor the scholar to the dunce, nor the employable to the bum, nor the pretty woman to the plain. The claim to equality outside the strictly political field is made only by those who feel themselves to be in some way inferior. What it expresses is precisely the itching, smarting, writhing awareness of an inferiority which the patient refuses to accept. Now, this is kind of dangerous grounds to fall upon because I could absolutely make this argument in our world today that if you're constantly screaming for your rights or your rights or your rights or I'm just as good as you are and so forth. And I think the philological game, the game of language has been played on I'm just as good as you are is the same concept as what I would say nowadays also when we say that's my right. Or in some cases, my rights are being trampled on and so forth, that we so misuse those terminologies. Because here's something I will tell you quite candidly and point blank. Not every person is created in the sense of equality in the way that our world makes it out to be. For example, and I'll just make this, we're all different. Each and every one of us is different. We're unique in our own ways. We have different backgrounds, histories, genetics. We have different aspects about us that are noticeably different, height, weight, ethnicity, and the rest. You have different talents and abilities, and my hope is that there are things that you are fantastically good at and things that you are brilliant at and things that you love, all of those things, but it does not make one better than someone else is and just because they're different. However, we've bought into a lie in our world currently that for a person to say that they're better at something is somehow means that the other person has no value. And, I would like to hope that there are pilots out there that are better than me at flying a plane because I can't fly a plane. I don't know how. Now, I might be able to learn and the rest, but I would hope that there are people out there where that is their love, that is their passion, it's what they're good at, they have better reflexes. We see this in sports all the time. We don't nearly have this as big of a problem in the sports world when you look around and say, well, they're just not as good. And our search for what we keep using the word equality, when in reality we mean equity, we mean equitable outcomes, not necessarily actually people having opportunity. I believe we are in a culture, we do have the same opportunities, not necessarily more across the board, but we should all have the same opportunities given to us. There should be no glass ceilings that are placed in those areas. But man, we have so misused this that I think we've fallen into this idea that we think we all should have the same outcomes, and that's highly problematic, and it's something that Lewis is hinting at here through these devils. And therefore resents. Yes, and therefore resents every kind of superiority in others, denigrates it, wishes it annihilation. So basically, if anybody's better than you at anything else, we get upset. And this is something our culture actually pushes in a big way. You cannot be better at something than someone else. And this is highly problematic. Presently, he suspects every mere difference of being a claim to superiority. No one must be different from himself in voice, clothes, manners, recreations, choice of food. Here is someone who speaks English rather more clearly and euphoniously than I. I must be a vile, upstage, la-di-da affectionate. So he's kind of mocking this here. Here's a fellow who says he doesn't like hot dogs, thinks himself too good for them, no doubt. Here's a man who hasn't turned on the jukebox. He's one of those highbrows and is doing it off to show off. If they were honest to God, all right, Joes, they'd be like me. There's no business to be different. It's undemocratic. And so he's playing this tune, and reality is this is fairly common. Now, this is a useful phenomenon and in itself by no means new. Under the name of envy, it has been known to humans for thousands of years. But hitherto they always regarded it as most odious and also the most comical of vices. Pride. Pride. And yet I'm going to make the argument that now our entire culture is about celebrating your pride, your individual pride, but also your collective pride and your identity in pride. Everything's around that. Those who were aware of feeling it felt it with shame. Those who were not gave it no quarter in others. The delightful novelty of the present situation is that you can sanction it, make it respectable, and even laudable by the incantory use of the word democratic. Or it's who you are, it's your identity. That's what he's hinting at. Under the influence of this incantation, those who are in any or every way inferior can labor more wholeheartedly and successfully than ever before to pull down everyone else to their own level. But that is not all. Under the same influence, those who come, or could come, nearer to a full humanity actually draw back from fear of being undemocratic. They willfully do not use their talents and abilities because they don't want to make others feel bad or less in some way. I am credibly informed that young humans now sometimes suppress an incipient taste for classical music or good literature because it might prevent their being like folks. That people who would really wish to be and are offered the grace which would enable them to be honest, chaste, or temperate, refuse it. To accept might make them different, might offend against the way of life, take them out of togetherness, impair their integration with the group. They might, horror of horrors, become individuals. And this groupthink mentality, I mean, this is playing itself out in our culture right now in such a massive way with the encampments at Columbia and at Harvard and all these different places, these pro-war, I mean, the complete lack of awareness, and I'll just be very blunt on this, the lack of awareness when you have transgenders for Palestine, for Gaza, with the inability to understand the fact that if they were to go there at this moment, that the leaders within Hamas would summarily execute them, torture them, execute them, and the rest. The detachment that happens is purely because of groupthink. It's cult-like groupthink that gets you into a point where you actively do not see the connections from the insanity of one side to the other, and yet you still find connections because you're no longer an individual. You are operating solely off of groupthink. All is summed up in the prayer which a young female human is said to have uttered recently. "Oh God, make me a normal 20th century girl." Thanks to our labors, this will mean increasingly make me a minx, a moron, and a parasite. Now, I'm not one to throw names out at people and the rest, but it saddens me that I do feel that this is actually very real. That what Lewis here hints at in 1959 has become the norm, and in fact, it almost seems like the playbook for a lot of what has happened. Meanwhile, as a delightful byproduct, the fewer every day, who will not be made normal or regular or like folks and integrated increasingly become in reality the prigs and cranks which the rabble would in any case have believed them to be, for suspicion often creates what it expects. Since whatever I do, the neighbors are going to think me a witch or a communist agent, I might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb and become one of in reality. As a result, we now have an intelligentsia which, though very small, is very useful to the cause of hell, the intelligentsia. So here's where he's going to get into another point that I think you're going to really like. But that is a mere byproduct. What I want to fix your attention on is the vast overall movement towards the discrediting and finally the elimination of every kind of human excellence, moral, cultural, social, or intellectual. And it is not pretty to notice how democracy, in the incantory sense, is now doing for us the work that was once done by the most ancient dictatorships and by the same methods. You remember how one of the Greek dictators, they called them tyrants then, sent an envoy to another dictator to ask his advice about the principles of government? The second dictator led the envoy into a field of grain, and there he snicked off with his cane the top of every stalk that rose an inch or so above the general level. The moral was plain. Allow no preeminence among your subjects. Let no man live who is wiser or better or more famous or even handsomer than the mass. Cut them all down to a level, all slaves, all ciphers, all nobodies, all equals. Thus tyrants could practice, in a sense, democracy. But now democracy can do the same work without any tyranny other than her own. No one need now go through the field with a cane. In fact, if you look at what is happening in our culture right now from our academia and the rest, this is the case. You see case after case that's being played out where ACTs are no longer being used as standardized testing and the rest because certain groups would fall below and there wasn't enough groups that were being part of it. I was listening earlier. There's certain ethnic groups had to sue. In fact, one in the Supreme Court recently because they were being discriminated against because too many were getting in versus other ethnic groups to specific universities. And so they had to, the university at the time had basically changed the entrance exams to make it easier for everyone to get in. So it's lower, lower, lower. And no one even need to go through the field with a cane anymore because our culture and society is doing it on the whole. We are cutting everyone down, making everybody as dumb as possible, it seems. There's no to seek greatness is somehow is an ego trip as opposed to one seeking the heights of academia or the rest. And you can go to the heights of academia, but if you look at some of the individuals who are there now across the U.S., you're seeing plagiarists, people who have copied, people with very few to little publications, almost none. And it's over and over again. How is this happening? Well, he just laid forth the entire premise. And this was in 1959. He set forth how to do it. The little stalks will now of themselves bite the tops off the big ones. The big ones are beginning to bite off their own in their desire to be like stalks. So there's constant, what I would call weaponized empathy, where nobody can be better than anybody, any one thing. And so we demean and demean and demean. And if you think of yourself better, be careful, because even if you agree with all the things, the second you do something wrong, they'll take you right down with them. I have said that to secure the damnation of these little souls, these creatures that have almost ceased to be individual, is a laborious and tricky work. But if proper pains and skills are expended, you can be fairly confident of the result. The great sinners seem easier to catch, but then they are incalculable. After you have played them for 70 years, the enemy may snatch them from your claws in the 71st. They are capable, you see, of real repentance. They are conscious of real guilt. They are, if things take the wrong turn, as ready to defy the social pressures around them for the enemy's sake as they were to defy them for ours. It is in some ways more troublesome to track and swat an evasive wasp than to shoot at close range a wild elephant. But the elephant is more troublesome if you miss. My own experience, as I have said, was mainly on the English sector, and I still get more news from it than any other. It may be said that what I am now going to say will not apply so fully to the sectors in which some of you may be operating, but you can make to the necessary adjustments when you get there. Some application it will almost certainly have. If it has too little, you must labor to make the country you are dealing with more like what England already is. In that promising land, the spirit of "I'm as good as you" has already begun something more than a generally social influence. It begins to work itself into their educational system. How far its operations there have gone at the present moment, I should not like to say with certainty, nor does it matter. Once you have grasped the tendency, you can easily predict its future developments, especially as we ourselves will play our part in the developing. The basic principle of the new education is to be that dunces and idlers must not be made to feel inferior to intelligent and industrious pupils. That would be undemocratic. There are moments where I'm reading through this book where I go, this was written like earlier this year, right? This was written like with what's happening currently going on over the last 6 months in our culture. And it wasn't. It was written in 1959. But it's so spot on that it's also terrifying, the fact that he's writing from a demon's perspective on what to do to capture the minds and hearts of the next generation of individuals, of souls. And this is what he's setting forth, and that would be undemocratic. These differences between pupils, for they are obviously and nakedly individual differences, must be disguised. This can be done at various levels. At universities, examinations must be framed so that nearly all the students get good marks. Entrance examinations must be framed so that all or nearly all citizens can go to universities whether they have any power or wish to profit by higher education or not. College education for all. I mean, do you not hear these? These are the actual... It's almost like this is the playbook that has been set forth for some of our political parties currently. It's astounding. At schools, the children who are too stupid or lazy to learn languages and mathematics and elementary science can be set to doing things that children used to do in their spare time. Let them, for example, make mud pies and call it modeling. I'm just going to throw out this word, modern art. Just going to leave it there. But all the time, there must be no faintest hint that they are inferior to the children who are at work. Whatever nonsense they are engaged in must have, I believe the English already use the phrase, parity of esteem. An even more drastic scheme is not possible. Children who are fit to proceed to a higher class may be artificially kept back because the others would get a trauma. Beelzebub, what a useful word, by being left behind. Just going to throw this out there. Do you guys remember there was a whole entire premise, a whole entire political of No Child Left Behind? And then you look at how often the word trauma is directly used in our culture today, over and over and over again. The bright pupil thus remains democratically fettered to his own age group throughout his school career, and a boy who would be capable of tackling Aeschylus or Dante sits listening to his Koval's attempts to spell out "a cat sat on a mat." Oh man, in a word, we may reasonably hope for the virtual abolition of education when I'm as good as you has fully had its way. All incentives to learn and all penalties for not learning will be prevented. Who are they to overtop their fellows? And anyway, the teachers, or should I say nurses, will be far too busy reassuring the dunces and patting them on the back to waste any time on real teaching. We shall no longer have to plan and toil to spread imperturbable and conceit or incurable ignorance among them. The little vermin themselves will do it for us. Of course, this would not follow unless all education becomes state education. But it will. That is part of the same movement. Penal taxes designed for that purpose are liquidating the middle class, the class who were prepared to save and spend and make sacrifices in order to have their children privately educated. The removal of this class, besides linking up with the abolition of education, is fortunately an inevitable effect of the spirit that says, "I'm as good as you." This was, after all, the social group which gave to the humans the overwhelming majority of their scientists, physicians, philosophers, theologians, poets, artists, composers, architects, jurists, and administrators. If ever there was a bunch of stalks that needed their tops knocked off, it was surely they. As an English politician remarked not long ago, a democracy does not want great men. It would be idle to ask of such a creature whether by want it meant need or like. But you had better be clear, for here Aristotle's question comes up again. We in hell would welcome the disappearance of democracy in the strict sense of the word, the political arrangement so-called. Like all forms of government, it often works to our advantage, but on the whole less often than other forms. And what we must realize is that democracy, in the diabolical sense, I'm as good as you, being like folks, togetherness, is the fittest instrument we could possibly have for extirpating political democracies from the face of the earth. So basically saying, so communism and socialism and all those types of things and groupthink is how we get rid of the one thing that actually kind of works, which is democracy. For democracy, or the democratic spirit, diabolical sense, leads to a nation without great men. A nation mainly of subliterates, full of the cocksureness which flattery breeds on ignorance, and quick to snarl or whimper at the first sign of criticism. And that is what hell wishes every democratic people to be. For when such a nation meets in conflict, a nation where children have been made to work at school, where talent is placed in high post, and where the ignorant mass are allowed no say at all in public affairs, only one result is possible. The democracies were surprised lately when they found that Russia had got ahead of them in science. What a delicious specimen of human blindness! If the whole tendency of their society is opposed to every sort of excellence, why did they expect their scientists to excel? It is our function to encourage the behavior, the manners, the whole attitude of mind, which democracies naturally like and enjoy, because these are the very things which, if unchecked, will destroy democracy. You would almost wonder that even humans don't see it themselves. Even if they don't read Aristotle, that would be undemocratic. You would have thought the French Revolution would have taught them that the behavior aristocrats naturally like is not the behavior that preserves aristocracy. They might then have applied the same principle to all forms of government. But it would not end on that note. I would not, hell forbid, encourage in your own minds that delusion which you must carefully foster in the minds of your human victims. I mean the delusion that the fate of nations is in itself more important than that of individual souls. Oh, that's such a key component there. Don't miss that. I mean the delusion that the fate of nations is in itself more important than that of individual souls. The overthrow of free peoples and the multiplication of slave states are for us a means, besides, of course, being fun. But the real end is the destruction of individuals. For only individuals can be saved or damned, can become sons of the enemy or food for us. The ultimate value for us of any revolution, war, or famine lies in the individual anguish, treachery, hatred, rage, and despair in what it may produce. I'm as good as you as a useful means for the destruction of democratic societies, but as a far deeper value as in an end of itself, as a state of mind which necessarily, excluding humility, charity, contentment, and all the pleasures of gratitude or admiration, turns a human being away from almost every road which might finally lead him to heaven. But now for the pleasantness part of my duty. It falls to my lot to propose on behalf of the guests the health of Principal Slubgob and the Tempter's Training College. Fill your glasses. What is this I see? What is this delicious bouquet I inhale? Can it be? Mr. Principal, I unsay all my hard words about the dinner. I see and smell that even under wartime conditions, the college cellars still has a few dozen of sound old vintage Pharisee. Well, 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 this is like old times. Hold it beneath your noses for a moment, gentle devils. Hold it up to the light. Look at those fiery streaks that writhe and tangle in the dark heart as if they were contending. And so they are. You know how this wine is blended? Different types of Pharisee have been harvested, trodden and fermented together to produce its subtle flavor. Types that were most antagonistic to one another on earth. Some were all rules and relics and rosaries. Others were all drab clothes, long faces, and petty traditional abstinences from wine or cards or the theater. Both had in common their self-righteousness and an almost infinite distance between their actual outlook and anything the enemy really is or commands. The wickedness of each other religions was the really live doctrine in the religion of each. Slander was its gospel, and denigration its litany. How they hated each other up where the sun shone, how much more they hate each other now that they are forever conjoined but not reconciled. So this last little part here that he goes into after this incredible kind of diatribe against education, the way it all plays itself out, and groupthink versus individualism and the rest. But don't miss what he's getting at here is also, by the way, there are those in the religious world, the Pharisees, the dogmatics who have gone after each other. They too make the greatest of drinks, in essence, of wines in the afterlife for the demons to play upon. So it's not just the people going through the motions that he goes through and mentions. It's actually the religious too. Their their resentment at the combination, the festering of their eternally impenitent spite, passing into our spiritual digestion, will work like fire, dark fire. All said and done, my friends, it will be an ill day for us if what most humans mean by religion ever vanishes from the earth. It can still send us the truly delicious sins. Nowhere do we tempt so successfully as on the very steps of the altar. And boy, do I love that little premise. Your eminence, your disgraces, my thorns, shadies, and gentle devils, I give you the toast of Principal Slubgob and the college. Signed, Screwtape. Now, this is the end of it all. So let me tell you, thank you for all that you've done, for participating with me this entire year. If you've watched through all the videos, I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for all that you've been able to go through with us. I love you all. Can't wait to see if I get to see you in person in the coming days. Whatever may become, if I can serve you in any way, please let me know. I'll be happy to do that. Until the next time, we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.